Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, February 9th, 2016 at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and this is Advancement Live. I'm your host for today, Andrew Gosen. On today's live broadcast, we're talking about tracking digital conversions and advancement. This is a more technical topic than we usually tackle on Advancement Live, but it was actually inspired by an episode of Advancement Live that I did last December with Mike O'Neill and Ashley Budd talking about paid social media. And in that conversation, we got to talking about how if you're going to make the case for spending money on paid promotion of content on the social networks, you better have a plan in place for measuring your success and improving your performance over time. And in the course of that conversation, we started talking about the fact that people on the program side of advancement shops don't always necessarily know what range of tools are out there to help do this. Now, social media and web analytics certainly can quantify things like traffic and volume for a particular web page, but they don't help us answer questions about the ROI of digital, of particular marketing initiatives or campaigns in the same way that conversion metrics do. If we can link things like event registrations, memberships, and giving to particular digital channels or campaigns, we're going to be in a much better position to explain the impact of our work and to iterate and improve on what we do than we would be otherwise. And this is also important in terms of making the case for additional investment in digital. So this poses a question. Given that the technology to track conversions actually exists, that it's not prohibitively expensive, and that it's widely deployed in web environments outside of higher ed, why isn't higher ed placing more of an emphasis on figuring out how to track conversions? This seems especially odd since budgets continue to be under scrutiny, and the Case M. Stoner Huron Consulting Survey indicates that year after year, inadequate resourcing is an obstacle to higher ed digital pros being able to accomplish what it is they're ever trying to accomplish. Well, I can think of many reasons why this might be the case. There's the age-old problem of inertia. There is the problem of program staff working so hard and so fast to keep their heads above water that they don't really have any time to step back and implement anything new. But I think another possibility is that people who are working in higher ed advancement shops on the program side may lack the concepts and the vocabulary to talk to their web teams or vendors about this need in the right way, in an effective way that makes it clear what it is that they're trying to accomplish. And that is the issue that we're tackling today. In this episode of Advancement Live, Greg Zguta will help us get this important dialogue started. But before we dive in, let me say some quick words of thanks to our sponsors. Advancement Live is part of the Higher Ed Live Network, offering viewers direct access to the best and brightest minds in education. Live broadcasts allow viewers to share knowledge and participate in discussions around the most important issues in the industry. All episodes of Advancement Live are free and accessible in the video archives at higheredlive.com and in podcast format on iTunes. Today's live broadcast is made possible by iModules. iModules, the leader in constituent engagement solutions, can help you manage all of your content in one integrated platform. You can learn more at iModules.com. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with education institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. Your program pages are some of the most marketing critical on your website, and your faculty has expertise that can provide a critical content pool to raise the prominence of your institution. Do you have a content strategy to leverage these important resources? Register now for M. Stoner's free 2-part webinar series. We are tweeting out a link right now where you can learn more and sign up. And now I'd like to introduce today's guest, Greg Zguta. Greg is the technical lead at M. Stoner, which involves everything from technology strategy to content management system selection to website implementation, training, and support. In a nutshell, his job is to make the website work. Greg has been working on web projects since 1994. He began his career at the University of Missouri School of Journalism, and in 1996, he took a position at Global Image, which was M. Stoner's sister company until becoming one big happy family in 2010. In his time with Global Image, Greg worked as a developer, project manager, and technical lead on projects in higher education, healthcare, financial services, e-commerce, and more. Greg has a strong background in software development, along with experience with multiple CMSs, database platforms, programming languages, and various types of system integration into the web. And one of the reasons he seemed like such a perfect guest for this particular topic is that he understands all of the technical nuances and complexities, but he's able to talk about them in ways that resonate with non-tech people. And we're hoping to take advantage of that skill of his today. So Greg, thank you so much. And thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Yeah, thanks. It's good to be here.
So for those of you watching along, please feel free to ask questions using the hashtag HigherEdLive. And I will do my best to ask questions to Greg as they come on in. Before diving on in, let me make it clear that as Greg and I were kicking around how we were going to structure this show, we were very deliberately trying to provide an introduction to some of these concepts around digital conversion tracking that will enable people who are working on the program side of advancement shops to understand what the possibilities are and what the components are that help make all of this possible. But we're trying to keep this non-technical enough that you'll be able to wrap your heads around it. And ideally, at the end of this, you'll be able to talk to your web team, talk to your vendors, talk to some of your partners within your shop about how to begin putting some of these pieces in place to better assess the impact of your efforts and understand how they're performing as you work towards your strategic goals. So Greg, let's start with a very basic question. Could you talk to us a little bit about what conversion metrics are and why they're important?
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned some of these at the outset. So some of these key activities that we want visitors to take on our websites. So we want them to request information. We want them to schedule visits, prospective students. We want them to apply. We want them to give, register for events. And so, there are also some other metrics that are a little bit softer maybe. So things like, consuming content and, reading information, content that teams spend a lot of time creating. And we want to be able to measure all those things and know that visitors, converted ultimately and succeeded in taking the actions that we want them to take. And in higher ed, it's always been a little bit more of a challenge than in the e-commerce world, where the idea of a conversion is pretty simple. We want somebody to make a purchase, buy a pair of shoes or put something in their shopping cart. And so you measure all those things all along the way, and they all have dollar values associated with them. So a lot of times people think of conversions when they're thinking about analytics as needing to have a dollar value associated with them to be straightforward. But I think a lot of times they can just be these really simple actions that we're wanting visitors to take. We have a campaign going on to try and get people to register for an event, and the number of people who registered, is our key conversion. And if we can tie those conversions back to our activities on the website, then that's going to help us, be more successful, get more, funding and the types of things we need to promote these things. So it all comes back around to getting people to take the action that we want them to take. And so to translate that into, a little bit about what we need to be able to do that, a lot of times it comes down to Google Analytics, or the mechanisms we're using to track the traffic on our websites. And in higher education, 90+%, close to 100% of websites have this kind of tracking enabled already. Somebody put it in there along the way. That doesn't mean that there aren't sometimes holes in it or it's incomplete, but it's a free tool and it's available to us to help do this. So we already know that. Go ahead, Andrew.
Sure, yeah, I just wanted to mention to viewers that as Greg mentions things throughout the course of this broadcast, we will be tweeting out links to the resources that he mentions. So you don't need to stress yourself out trying to look them up right now. Just follow the HigherEdLive hashtag and they will be coming to you shortly. Sorry, back to you.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that connect up these conversions. How do they manifest themselves within a tool like Google Analytics? And there are a few different pieces that we need within analytics to be able to make sense of these. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is the fact that a conversion is really what we would call a goal in Google Analytics. So Google Analytics has this concept of a goal, which is something that we define and configure within analytics that says a visitor took a particular action. So sometimes it's as simple as they visited this page. So if we define a goal on our website within our Google Analytics for visitors to visit a particular page, say a thank you page, after they've registered for an event that says, thanks for registering, we sent you an email, then we can capture that data as a conversion and measure that. So in addition to knowing that visitors went to your website and clicked on some other pages, the visitors that actually registered for the events are the ones that succeeded in that conversion, and that's a high value activity for us. So we want to know that they did that. So the way that we do that is Google Analytics goals, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, as we proceed here. But that's one of the key terms and key things that we can leverage within Google Analytics is set up goals.
Clarifying question, if I may. So
yeah.
You have the capacity within Google Analytics to set as a goal almost any type of action that a user possibly could take on a web page.
Yeah, you can. And the trick with them is that they are not done automatically for you. So to install Google Analytics on your website, you're just taking a bit of tracking code, some HTML and JavaScript, and putting it on every page of your website. So when you have a content management system, that's pretty easy to do. The web team or the developers will put that code on every page of the site. But for something like a conversion, we've got to set it up and configure it. And there are 4 types of these that you can do within Google Analytics. The first one is probably the simplest and often used. It's based on a destination page. So the example I mentioned, the thank you page. If you know the URL of the page that you want someone to go to that tells you that they submitted a form or completed the action that you want, then you can define that URL and say, when a visitor goes to this page, count that as a conversion and give it a name. So registered for an event, or gave online, or whatever the name of that conversion is. There are 3 other types of goals that you can use. That some of them are used less commonly. So one of them is duration. So you can measure how long a visitor spends on your site, clicking from page to page. So this is one that people use to measure engagement. It's a little bit softer conversion because it doesn't necessarily mean that someone registered for an event or took one of those key actions, but it means that they spent time reading feature stories or consuming content for a certain duration of time, and that we had an opportunity to make an impact over several minutes, several pages of the website visit. So duration is another goal we can use. Another one is number of pages per visit or per session. So how many pages did a visitor come to when they went to the website? And similar to duration, a little bit softer, not as tied to an activity like a registration. And then the last type of conversion metric we can set up that's probably the most complex to configure, but it's very powerful, is a conversion based on what's called an event. So then this spins up another bit of terminology in Google Analytics, the concept of event tracking. So the way I like to start explaining event tracking is that on web pages, it's pretty easy to understand the idea of tracking visits to each page. As a user goes from one page to another, we record each page that they viewed. But increasingly on our websites, we have interactions that a visitor can take without leaving the page. So they might click on a carousel and view multiple images in a carousel. Or sometimes we have tabs or menus within the web page that don't take you to another page. They just expand or open a new piece of content. And so those sorts of actions aren't tracked by default, but Google Analytics defines those as event tracking. There's an event where a user clicked or did some action, and we captured that and recorded it. So we can record almost any sort of click or interaction with the website as an event and define our own, name. So they clicked on a tab or they clicked on a carousel. But it's something that we have to configure and create. So the tech team has to go out and define what these are. A classic example is clicking on a download. So if I link to a file on my website and I want to know how many people downloaded the file is just a file. It's not a web page. But using event tracking, I can understand how many people clicked on something. So it's downloading, a white paper or something, that someone may have, or a bit of research or an application form or what have you. We can track those as events. And then using an event, we can define a goal. So any particular event that we said we want visitors to click on this drop-down menu or open this carousel or what have you, once it's defined as an event, then it can become a goal. And so that's really powerful, even though it takes a little bit of configuration, from the tech folks to do.
So it sounds like a precondition for this to be effective in the context of a program area is some sort of a sit down early on in the process where the program folks talk about what their business goals are, and then the tech team thinks through what the appropriate goals are to actually measure progress on those particular conversions, which of course is the whole topic here. But it feels like there should be both parties at the table talking through what we're trying to achieve big picture in order to make sure that the goal tracking is set up appropriately.
That's right, because it's sort of the connection between the action we want the visitor to take and what technically is taking place that we can measure at that time. So as an example, excuse me, you can have a form. So say registering for an event, and you've got a number of form fields, and then you've got a button at the bottom. And sometimes when you fill out a form like that, you get the situation I described earlier, where you get a thank you page. It says, thanks for registering. But in other cases, you'll find that those forms, and when you get that thank you page, you'll see the URL changes, to something like thank you, and that's easy to measure as a destination goal in Google Analytics. So the tech folks could say, okay, we know we have a unique page. No one's going to visit that page unless they submitted this form, because that's the only time they would see this thank you page. In other cases, you click on the button, and the page just sort of refreshes and says, hey, thanks for registering for this event. We sent you an email, but we didn't change the URL that the visitor is visiting. So that's a nuance that the tech team would have to say, okay, instead of tracking the URL, because we don't want to know how many people went to the form, we want to know how many people submitted the form. And so now we need to know how many people clicked on this button. And that's where we might target that as an event and say, well, the event is clicking on this button. So we need the tech folks to write a little bit of code that allows Google Analytics to track all the clicks on that button. And then we can go into Google Analytics and say, hey, whenever someone clicked on that button, that's a conversion of registering for an event. And we can track that and record it, tie it back to our other activities on the web.
Great, thanks for the clarification. So I sidetracked you, I'm sorry. We were going through basic Google Analytics and...
Yeah, so we talked about the 4 different kinds of goals. So we've got these destination goals, we have duration, we have pages per session, we have events. And the 2 that are most useful in doing these conversions are probably the destination goals or events. For every form, every registration, every giving form, we've either got a thank you page or a button that someone's clicking on that we could target. And so with the right configuration, we can turn those into conversions and view those within our analytics reports. But a couple other things within Google Analytics that'll make this more useful. The first of those is this idea of campaigns. So, anytime you're doing these sorts of activities, often they're offline, there's a campaign that involves a number of aspects of the initiative around getting an event online and getting folks to register for that. How are we letting them know about that? Within Google Analytics, we can use the concept of campaigns. So a Google Analytics campaign that allows us to define and tag our inbound traffic to the website. So when we send out an email newsletter, we can identify the folks who went to that, links on that newsletter, came to our website, performed some activities, and maybe converted by submitting our form. Or we can tag links that we place on other websites, or if we're doing advertising. So when someone clicks somewhere, we can track that they clicked, on this ad or this particular link and came into our website. And within Google Analytics, see what those visitors are doing separately, including their conversions. And so you can imagine that becomes very powerful now. If we know that we did something to send this traffic to the website, we saw this activity on the website, and then we saw this conversion where someone took the action that we wanted to, and we can attribute that directly to, you know, the newsletter we sent out, or the ad that we took out, or the link that we shared on social media, or what have you. So to use these campaigns is actually really straightforward. This is something that doesn't require much configuration in the tool. It just requires a little planning. So Google has a tool called the URL Builder that will help you with this. And it allows you to take a link that you are wanting to direct users to. So sometimes it's just your home page, but sometimes maybe it's something about an event, or something a little bit deeper within your site. Wherever we're going to direct inbound traffic to, and add a few parameters to the end of the URL. So if you give Google the URL and give it a name for your campaign and a couple other attributes that will help it track that, you know, so you can indicate whether or not it was, you know, this is an email newsletter, this was a display ad, this is a social post. Google can roll those up into a URL that it gives you to share and says, use this URL, and then everyone who visits this URL and goes to your website will have their activity tracked under the campaign name that you gave, so that we can now see everything that those visitors are doing. And that's really powerful, and only requires that you set up those, you know, bits of campaign tagging before you share the URL. And that helps distinguish visitors who just went to your website or found it via search or what have you, from the ones who really followed a link that was part of your campaign.
This may be a difficult question to answer, but ballpark, how long does it take to set something like this up if you know what you're doing?
Well, the campaign portion of it is, you know, relatively easy. It's an extra step when you're going to, you know, post to social media, or, you know, send out links, send out a newsletter to do this tagging. And it depends on how many links you have, but that's a smaller portion of it. Getting the conversions set up on the back end is something that is typically not a lot of work, but the work involves multiple people. So we need someone who understands the, you know, the business objective, the goal of the conversion, that it's registering for this event, or it's giving using this form that has value, and then connecting with the tech folks who we might need to help us get the right tracking code in place. You know, because sometimes we haven't really talked about this much, but sometimes these are third-party systems. So this isn't even on our website. It's on another website someone hosts for us that we link to. And so how do we manage that? But getting those folks on board to create the tracking that we need. And then testing it, because these are things that aren't really visible. So when we publish new content to our website, it's easy for us to see that the content's there. But when we publish some tracking code to help us track these conversions, until we test those conversions and look in the reports, it's hard for us to see that we have success. It's not as tangible. And that's one of the things that makes it a little bit harder, because it's out of sight, out of mind.
It's also sounding to me like doing this successfully simply requires working ahead in a way that I know many organizations find it difficult to do. Like, I can't tell you how many experiences I've had with program people running around the floor trying to find the web team saying, you've got to put this page up now because I have an email going out in 30 minutes, right, and I need to know that it's up, right? And so success, which requires all sorts of additional effort, is simply getting that page up, and there's none of this laying of groundwork for successful, thoughtful, systematic tracking of both inbound traffic and then the conversions. And it feels to me like this is the kind of thing that once you've done it 2 or 3 times, you probably get a feel for how much time you're going to need to invest in this, and you just build it into your timeline for the project. But boy, that first 2 or 3 times, you probably want to make sure that you allocate enough time to do it the right way.
Yeah, and the trick with some of this is that I think sometimes we're fooled into thinking that we're going to have the information we need to dig into the analytics for this stuff when we're ready to do it. Because everyone's got Google Analytics on their website, but to do some of the more valuable things like tracking conversions or using campaigns requires that thinking in advance. Because, you know, Google Analytics will record data, from over time. So as interactions take place, that data gets recorded. So obviously we can't retroactively go back and collect data about a visitor who visited the form last week if we didn't have our mechanisms in place when they visited. So even though we have Google Analytics and we know that they visited the form, if we didn't have our conversion tracking in place, we're not going to know about that conversion. We can't go back and find out about it, beyond the fact that they went to the form. And that's sometimes the challenge when you have existing, things that you'd like to track, because they're already out there in the wild. And then it requires a step back to say, okay, we're not deploying something new, but we do need to go back and understand, okay, what are the technical details of how this submission works? So the tech folks can help us figure out how we'll track this conversion. And then what are the marketing activities that we're going to undertake? Because, last month's newsletter, the ship has sailed on that, and we didn't have campaign tagging on it to be able to attribute traffic and conversions to that. But for the next one, we can. And, it requires taking that step back when it's not a new initiative, but something that's already underway, to kind of insert into that process and get all the things that you need in place. And again, I think that the tasks associated with this are all pretty small. They just have to take place in a number of different places, and a number of different people do them. And there's no one who owns the whole thing. Who says, this is all my responsibility. In higher ed, there are very few folks charged exclusively with analytics or making sure this all happens. So, it requires someone to take the ownership of it and say, I'm going to make sure that the tech folks do what they need to do, and the folks who are sending out newsletters do the campaign tagging. And then we test it and see that we're tracking these conversions and make that part of our process for future initiatives.
So let's talk a little bit more about the testing. The second topic that you and I had identified as important to cover in this conversation was, if you invest the time and the effort in getting all of the right people around the table and doing these tasks to put the infrastructure in place, what's the outcome? Why is it worth spending some time wrapping your head around how to do this and actually getting things implemented? So ultimately, why should we track conversions? What's the business impact of doing so?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few big things. I mean, because really, I think of these conversions as, the key performance indicators for what we're doing on the web. Our KPIs, and that's a real businessy sort of term. But a lot of times, the actions, the things that impact the bottom line for whatever unit you're in, whatever your objectives are going to be your conversions. And so if we're able to track those and understand the activity that we're doing that's helping impact the bottom line in that way, whether it's registering for an event, or it's giving, or it's requesting information, or what have you, it really helps support the time that we're spending on those things. And I tell people that this is true even for things like content. So, a lot of institutions have folks devoted in a number of places across campus to creating feature content and creating rich content that's going to go out in social media, or it's going to go up on the website. And we want to know people are looking at those things, and that can be a conversion too. So some of the softer conversions I talked about, they're all about showing the value the web is providing by showing that these key actions that we wanted to take place, that we agree on being valuable, are taking place. Some of this stuff also provides decision-making support too. So if we have some information about the things that are working to get people to an event, or to get people to take an action online, we can do more of that. And if we take some actions, we spend money on advertising or something else that is not leading to results, we can use those resources for something different next time. And it's simple when you have that data to make those decisions, but all too often, I think, especially in higher ed, we're forced to, take some guesses or use anecdotal evidence that something worked. And this, provides real bottom line connection between, marketing activities and actions we're taking and results.
Yeah, I think these points you're making are incredibly important, and I just like to underscore a few of them. you mentioned the issue of comparing different things you do for their relative effectiveness and then being able to reallocate resources from the less successful to the more successful. And I think that's incredibly important, especially in the alumni affairs realm, where we're very good about starting to do new things, especially because we get lots of pressure from our constituents to try new things. We're much less good about not doing old things anymore. And it feels to me like the two are actually different sides of the same coin, and that sometimes you need to reallocate limited resources from the old thing to be able to do the new thing well. And I've found myself that actually having data to substantiate why you're proposing to do away with the old thing can help make that spoonful of medicine go down a little bit more easily with constituents who happen to feel a strong affinity towards that old thing.
Yeah.
Data is hard to argue with. And the other thing I really like about the way you're describing this is that many of us are under pressure as part of the annual work planning process to identify what the metrics are that we're going to use to say whether or not we were successful during the course of the year. And then sometimes this rolls up into a top level organizational report, which then I suppose gets rolled up even further and goes up towards senior administration. But it feels to me like if you've actually put the time into thinking about what these KPIs are and you've got all of the analytics in place to track them, suddenly the biannual or semi-annual or annual exercise of compiling these things becomes pretty simple, because you know where the numbers are, you know they're accurate, you know how they were compiled. Presumably, by definition, they relate to your key business goals. And suddenly you aren't dealing with the hysteria of trying to figure out ways to find numbers that you can use to report if you've gone and you put this sort of an analytic infrastructure in place.
Yeah, I mean, and that really ties into the idea that these type of analytics are, part of a continuous cycle. So it's not something that you do once, but it just becomes ingrained in the process. And once it's part of the process, it's really not as much additional effort, because it's, when we go to, send out URLs in the newsletter, we tag them in this way so that we have the analytics later. And when we create a new form to register for an event or something like that, we identify how we'll capture the conversion and set that up. And it just becomes another task, along with all the other tasks that are already being managed, to put an initiative out there. And then having that data available to you on a regular basis really allows you to evaluate things pretty easily. And when I say that, it's not mountains and mountains of data. And while that data is out there, folks who track conversions, you might track 4 or 5 numbers, right? How many people registered for events, gave online, maybe went to this key content, request information, just a few of those things, and tracking them over time give you a lot of information. And then you can ignore a lot of the other stuff where people get into these nitty-gritty details where you're anecdotally trying to make a case for something based on some data that's not quite complete. If you have very clear data, the idea of reporting on it is pretty simple, because it's 4 or 5 things that we said were important, and here are the numbers.
Totally agree. So we've been talking thus far at a reasonably high level about what the various components are that constitute a conversion tracking process, and some of the organizational considerations that you need to think about as you're beginning to move in this direction. I was wondering if I could ask you to get a little bit weedy here and actually sort of walk us through what this process looks like, soup to nuts, in terms of setting up this conversion tracking chain, and maybe provide some examples of what this actually looks like in practice.
Yeah, let's do that. So let me talk through a couple things, and then I can share my screen here and show a few things as well. So I think one of the challenges that we've touched on a few times in this discussion already is that there's a lot of gray area around responsibilities. So what I'm hoping is that this breaks down what some of the pieces are, and you don't have to know everything about all the pieces. So how the tracking code works, or how to track it, how to capture this, click on this button, to know that there's a task around doing that. And I think that's where having someone who can be a point person, kind of a project lead for making sure that this happens on a project, can communicate with the folks who do know those answers and help make it happen. There's a definite collaboration between technology, between marketing folks, sometimes between vendors who manage other systems where we need to reach out to them and just make sure that these things happen. So the things that you need, start with Google Analytics tracking code on your website. And so, like I mentioned, most people have this already, but there are some nuances to that. So, if all your pages are coming out of a single content management system, it's usually pretty easy for all your pages to have the tracking code on it. But when we link over to, a form coming from a third-party system, where a URL changes up in our browser, then we can run into a case where that the tracking code doesn't exist on that page. So partly what we'll want to do is identify the path. What are the pages that a visitor is going to go to complete a key action, and make sure the tracking code is on all those pages. So it's not to suggest that marketing folks need to do that. That's a job for the tech folks to make sure that tracking code is there. And if it's not, then what do we need to do to get the tracking code out there? And sometimes that means reaching out to a vendor and saying, we've got Google Analytics tracking code. We want to put it on the site. Can we give you the tracking code and put it out there, and then have our tech folks make sure it's there? So the first piece is that Google Analytics tracking code. And one thing I'll highlight here that I've seen that can make this more complicated than it needs to be is there are plenty of institutions that have multiple Google Analytics accounts, right? Admissions has a Google Analytics account. University Marketing and Communications has one for the main website. Alumni and Development have one for the alumni site. And those accounts don't talk to each other. So when someone moves across the university website between those areas, their traffic can be tracked and siloed into those different accounts. So one thing to consider is not just that we have the Google Analytics tracking code, but ideally it's in the same account, or at least for kind of a business unit where the same activities are taking place, that we're directing our visitors to, that we have the same tracking code. And unfortunately, I've seen a lot of institutions where there are dozens or more different Google Analytics accounts. And so one of the challenges there is, let's agree on what the main account is, or use the fact that Google Analytics will let us track multiple accounts to just get the relevant code in place. And again, it's a technology task, but there's an organizational aspect to it where we need to have some communication about where does all our data go, so that we can use it. So having that tracking code in place is step one. Step two is to create those goals, do that configuration within Google Analytics. So that's something that on the Google Analytics side isn't necessarily a technical task, but requires that coordination with the tech team to help us identify, well, what's the URL of the thank you page that tells us that this was a successful conversion, or how are we capturing that click on the button so that we can define that as a goal. And then let's create the goal in Google Analytics, and I'll show you an example here in a minute. And then the next step would be, if we want to use campaigns to track the specific activities we're doing to send traffic to our website, let's use that Google URL builder to tag our URLs with campaign information, so we know when we send out an email newsletter and someone clicks on a link from there and registers for an event, that registration is associated with that marketing activity that we did. But you can make use of conversions without using campaigns, so I definitely want to be clear about that. But when you have these marketing activities that you're trying to segment and understand which work better than others, tagging those URLs so that when people came from different sources can be a big benefit. And that's something that happens actually separate from Google Analytics. It's something you're attaching to those URLs you send out. So that's the third piece that you need. And then the last piece is the reporting piece. And that's just going into Google Analytics and looking for conversions, maybe by campaign, or maybe just wholesale, how many people completed this activity that we wanted over a particular time frame or what have you. So those are the pieces that we want to have. So let me share my screen here, and we can we can look at a few of these things. So over here we have Google Analytics account. And let me start off with this screen. So I'm not trying to scare anyone, but just so that we know what we're talking about here, what I've highlighted here, when you go into your Google Analytics account, you can get your tracking code, and this isn't going to make sense to anybody but a developer. But all we need to know is that that's the little bit of code that we're asking vendors to put on their pages, or that we're asking our tech team to make sure it's on all our pages of the website. And within that code, it uses this tracking ID. So every Google Analytics account, and one account can house multiple web properties. So we want to make sure that we're using that same tracking ID. So that's where if admissions has a tracking ID, alumni have a tracking ID, marketing and communications have a tracking ID, and they're all different, we may want to sync those up or consider making sure there's one tracking ID we use across the site so we can follow our users as they go around the institution. But that's what we're talking about with the tracking code. And that's something you can access within Google Analytics, and we just want to get in the proper places and make sure it's the right code. So once that's complete, and we were having the conversation with the tech team about, okay, here's a conversion. It's a request, or it's a register for an event form. We create these goals. So here's an example from a client we worked with, the Lake Forest Graduate School of Management, that has a number of goals, and it's a little bit hard to see maybe how they've defined this. But we create a goal, we give it a name, and we define what type of goal it is. And then here's the goal details. It can get a little techy depending on how you're configuring it, but it's a URL. So I'll switch over here to an mStoner example. It's really simple. Here's a goal that begins with blog. mStoner wants to send traffic to the blog, and that's a goal that we want to measure. And so by putting in that URL, so if this was a thank you page or something else, we would just put that URL in here and say, whenever someone hits this URL, that is how we'll define a conversion for this particular goal. And it's a similar process for an event-driven goal. So if we have a click on a button because we don't have a good URL for the thank you page, then we just define it slightly different and say, well, it's this event that happens with this value on it. So register for an event, button click, and you'll track that as a goal. Another thing I'll mention about these destination goals that you hear people talk about maybe sometimes, and that's this idea of a funnel. So, to add a little complexity to goals, if you want, you can have a set of steps that you expect your visitor to take as they move toward a conversion. So the classic example of this is like a shopping cart, right? Someone comes to the website, they browse for products, they find a pair of shoes, they add it to their cart, then they complete a checkout process and make a purchase. So you can measure those steps along the way and say, well, we had 1,000 people who visited the website and looked at these shoes, and 10% of those added them to their shopping cart, and 10% of the ones who added it to their shopping cart completed a purchase. And by tracking a funnel, multiple steps toward a goal, you can start to evaluate where you lose people, because you have to start with a bigger pool of people who maybe followed your link to come visit your website, and a smaller number of people who registered for the event. So what can we do to influence those steps along the way? And destination goals let you enter multiple URLs along the path to your conversion. So we can see over here in our example from the Lake Forest Graduate School of Management, they have just a two-step process where they have folks, and it's light gray because I'm not set up to edit this, but visitors come to a landing page, they go to a contact us page, then they submit a form. So we can see how people move through and how many people we lose along the way. And that lets you test things like, well, what if we change this form so it has fewer fields, or we make it more friendly with validation so that when someone's entering their phone number, it's more forgiving about how they format the phone number, and people don't get frustrated and give up before they complete their conversion. So that's what it looks like to set up a goal. I mean, the activity itself is pretty small. It just always requires a combination of enough technical knowledge about what we're tracking with enough, business and marketing knowledge about what the conversion is and why we want to create it and how we're going to report on it later to get that set up. So the last piece I wanted to show here, well, let me jump over and show this Google URL builder real quickly. So this is a link that Andrew may have tweeted out already, but this allows you to use a simple form to give it, provide a URL. So here's the landing page I want to direct traffic to when I post this to social media. I can identify a campaign source. So, is this a newsletter, or what's the source of this this particular activity? I can choose a medium, and there's some other optional things here. Not optional is the campaign name. But by using these different attributes and tagging my URL, when I generate URL at the end, Google will give me the URL I need. And when people follow that, automatically that campaign data is going to show up in my Google Analytics report so that I can look at it. And I don't have to configure anything on the Google Analytics side to make these campaign URLs work. So this is a really powerful tool and underutilized in higher ed, so that Google URL Builder will help you create your campaigns. But then the real benefit of this comes when we go to reporting. So this, again, I borrowed from my friends at Lake Forest Graduate School of Management, one of their conversion reports. And this is just looking at, the benefit of conversions is there are a lot of different reports within Google Analytics that you can look at to view your conversions through. So you can view, in this case, we're looking at, where visitors came from: search, referral, display ads, paid search, etc., social, and breaking down the different channels of visitors to our website and viewing the conversion rates over here in this far column. And we view these for each goal. So this is, the goal we're viewing here is we get a drop down at the top that shows us the goals we have configured. And we can change the goal that we're looking at and have the report update correspondingly to see that, visitors that came through via organic search converted 0.11% of the time versus almost 0.5% for this other category versus, 1/3% for direct traffic where they came straight to my website. And so you can do the same kind of report across your campaigns, where you might have different campaigns, different newsletters, advertising, social, however you want to organize your campaigns, and compare the conversion rates for your goals and move through one goal after another to look at those in your report. So you can find a number of different ways to generate some pretty simple reports, including just how many people converted. So if I go to conversions here and look at goals and look at the overview, I can see from my given time period, which days I had conversions and how many I had and what goals they were, and view that over time. So when I'm trying to impact change, I can compare your time periods just of raw conversions. How many people registered for an event last month versus this month? Now you have other ways of finding that because you know how many people are attending the event. When you can tie it back to your marketing activities, your campaigns, and the things you're doing to drive traffic to your website, it really can add a lot of value. So that's sort of my high-level overview there of what some of this stuff looks like when you piece it all together.
Greg, thank you. That was fantastic. I think actually seeing what the end product looks like helps make this less abstract for people in the audience who may not have quite as much of a technical background. And I can say from our experience here at Cornell, one example of how that type of reporting has been invaluable comes from our crowdfunding initiative. We got access to crowdfunding conversions, I'd say 6-8 months ago at this point, working with our partner Scale Funder. And one of the amazing things about it is that it really lets us see where the traffic comes from that results in gifts made to particular projects. That's important for two reasons. One of them is that we had one particular project that was outstandingly successful by any standard metric. We'd always assumed that email would convert at a rate that was roughly twice what traffic from social would convert at. And suddenly we had a project where they were actually converting on a 1-to-1 ratio. So the first reason that was important was we could go back to the project and say, what on earth did you do on social to make it that effective, right? So we're learning something about the process that we can abstract and we can bake into training for other folks. And then we also now have concrete evidence that if other people push as hard on social as this project did, that they can actually drive that sort of traffic. But it's a different conversation to show the exact details of how a project made their fundraising campaign happen on social based on data, as opposed to saying, well, you can do it, trust us on this. We find that especially with student groups, knowing that other student groups were able to do this inspires them to believe that they can actually do it themselves, and it helps them focus.
Yeah, it's really powerful stuff when you can see the impact, and then also think about, well, if we got this number of this amount of traffic coming from this campaign, and it resulted in this % of conversions, it's easy to extrapolate that if we can increase traffic, then we can expect conversions to increase, and we want to do that with the things that result in better conversions. But there are a lot of ingrained, I think, assumptions about which channels are most effective, because it's this anecdotal evidence that we get, that we hear from people, who say, well, I got this email or I saw this on social. But it's, if one or two people reach out and give you that feedback, it sort of biases, your feelings about that channel versus seeing the actual results, across all of your campaigns.
One other thing that came to mind as you were showing us that final report is that there's another hidden time cost to working in this way, and that is that you can get all of this all set up and have these beautiful reports right there that very directly reflect your most important conversion goals, but without somebody having it as part of their job to actually look at that data and think about it, you're not going to be able to turn that into actionable business intelligence that improves your program.
Right. Yeah, and then I think there are a lot of times that there is some valuable data. And the nice thing about conversions is you've already done the work of narrowing it down and saying, because you've decided what's important to you to measure, and that has the highest value. And it allows you to ignore a lot of the other data in there, where if you were to just go to look at your analytics to try and, understand, trends and what's happening, there's a lot more to sift through than if you can go straight to your conversions. And then, often it leads to other questions. So you look at campaigns and then think, well, do mobile visitors, am I serving my mobile visitors as well? Are people converting, coming from mobile devices? Or are they coming from, desktop computers? Or when did they convert? If I send out this email on Monday, I have more success than if I send it out on, Friday or over the weekend or some other time. And that, that's all built into your analytics to be able to answer those questions once you have them.
And then suddenly you're actually in a environment where you're doing data-driven decision making, which I would argue is the single surest and easiest way to actually improve your service to both your institution and your audience.
It is, and it really doesn't take, it doesn't mean that you have to be a business analyst who does this, 40 hours a week. Because I think with the right planning and thought, it's really just, something that you spend a few hours on going and looking back at results, at regular intervals in your projects.
So Greg, we're drawing near to the end of our hour. I'd like to close with one final very practical question, and that is this. If some viewers have been liking what they see here, and they decide they want to go initiate a conversation with their marketing teams or their tech teams about beginning to move in this direction, what's some advice you would have about how they should start that conversation to get it underway as productively as possible?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges of this and why it isn't already happening, everywhere all the time. That it's not really anybody's responsibility, but everybody's got to have a role in it. So, so it helps to have a person who can be the champion for it, even if they're not the expert in every aspect of it. So somebody who can lead it through and have a discussion and identify who the folks are from the technical side and who the folks are on the marketing side and who maybe third-party vendors are that we need to reach out to and shepherd it through. I think that sometimes people think of it as a technical discipline, and so we want the tech folks to handle all this, and they certainly need to do parts of it. We need their help getting some of the tracking code in place to do it properly, but it's really the business goals of the organization that need to drive the decision. And I think another challenge is that analytics are, it's free. Google Analytics is free. And I've used this analogy with other things, but it's kind of free like puppies are free. You've got a free puppy still needs a little bit of care and feeding. And so to get this going, you have to have someone who's willing to, shepherd it through and test it and see that it's working at least the first time so that we can get it going. And I think another challenge is these third-party sites. I think especially when we're talking about alumni development, we've got some common tools that are separate from our main content management systems, and web forms in higher education are often that way, whether it's CRM systems or something else. We link to forms, we embed forms, and those are where our conversions are. So we need help from our partners, our vendors that are providing those things to get that tracking code in place. And so it requires that point person to say, we're trying to take this from end to end. And so I need to make sure that the folks who are, running these campaigns have the information to use the URL builder, and that the tech folks who help us track the conversions know what things we need to capture and how we're going to do that. And that we also communicate those things to our vendors in an effective way. So it's a little bit of a small project, to have someone who can connect those things together, or it's part of your project. But I think the challenge is it's not tangible. And so having someone with it that understands the pieces well enough to see it through, to test that conversion and see it show up in the report, which is pretty gratifying when you see that happen the first time. And once you've done that, you're really well on your way to making that a repeatable process. So I think the baby step, kind of the first steps that I encourage people to think about, because this becomes a roadblock frequently, is to get that tracking code on the pages of your site. The steps that your visitors need to take to make a conversion need to have tracking code on them, because you can't set up the goal, you can't measure the conversion until you have that. And that's a task that's pretty easy to look at what those pages are, talk to some tech folks about checking the tracking code and making sure it's in the same account, and talking to a vendor about, hey, if we want to add Google Analytics code to this event registration form, who can help us do that? And once you have that in place, then a lot of the tools are in your hands.
My suspicion is actually that there are many tech teams out there in higher ed who would be delighted if someone came from a program area and asked them about this. Because just being given an assignment other than, okay, let's rush to get this page up at the last minute, it would be refreshing to have something interesting to do that's actually going to help them make the case that they're contributing to the bottom line business goals of the organization as well.
Yeah. And it's not a big, the amount of work effort is not a lot. I think it's all about the coordination. And so if the expectation is, hey, in an afternoon, I'm just going to make a few phone calls and get all this set up, there are enough moving parts sometimes, especially with the third-party systems, that understanding that any particular task isn't a lot of work effort, but just requires some coordination, helps set a good expectation for that. And so the good news is that when you go to your tech team and you ask, for some of this, you're not asking them to spend 40 hours of work. You're asking them to spend an hour now and maybe spend an hour in a week or two once the third-party vendor puts something in place. And that's what makes it hard, because it becomes out of sight, out of mind. We kind of it's got a lot of starts and stops. And if you can avoid that or have the right expectation for getting it set up, once you get over that hump and have those tools in place, it's not as though you have to do that every time you want to, run a new campaign. Those things will be the same. You only have to do it when you, deploy a new tool, which doesn't happen as frequently.
Greg, thank you so much. That's the end of our hour. I really appreciate your taking the time to walk us through this, and this has been at exactly the level I was hoping for people who work on the program side. I hope viewers will find this to be as valuable as I have. Let's see. My co-host Kim Brown is going to be back next week with another episode of Advancement Live. She is going to be talking about efforts to forge connections with soon-to-be alumni before they leave campus, while they're still on campus as students. And with that, I'd like to say thank you, as always, to our program sponsors, iModules and M Stoner. And once again, Greg, thanks so much for sharing your time and expertise with us. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Appreciate it.
All right, thanks everybody who tuned in live, and see you next time.